the health crisis. Because obviously, we cannot simply shut down. We need to maintain healthcare facilities. We need to maintain the production and distribution of food. We have to maintain our shelter and the maintenance of our shelter, of the infrastructure that allows these things to proceed, the provisioning of other goods and services that are necessary for maintaining the basic fabric of our society. And that means that although we have, in a sense, been asleep at the wheel by taking months to finally face up to the fact that we need to introduce mass testing of COVID-19, we have to provide far more ventilators and protective clothing to our healthcare providers. All of this is now forcing us to engage in very strict and severe social distancing. So for many, that appears that the only way to avert any kind of economic collapse is simply to give people money. And indeed, there's a lot of payments that should have been, in a way, received by people independent of any crisis.
This is going to get really funky in the first of the month in about a week and a half.
Yeah.
People are going to want money.
Yeah. I mean, we as a society have neglected fulfilling basic social rights that require certain basic benefits to essentially uphold family welfare, to balance work and family. For example, we need to have, in general, under any circumstances, child allowances. And the government says there should be $900 a month to provide for the extra cost of having a child. We need that to be able to support our children. We need also public child and elder care so that we can maintain our activity both in the economy and politics and know that our children and elders are being cared for. We need, of course, health care that is available to all independent of how much wealth they have. And that goes along with paid leave, both paid family leave and paid leave for one's own sickness. Because obviously, if one is in a position where one has to care for family members, one has to take off from work. Or alternately, if under circumstances of a pandemic, one has to go into quarantine, someone has to step in to take care of children and elders that family members have themselves been taken care of. Now, these involve fulfillments of social rights that ought to have been in place. Now it's a matter of survival. If we are going to quench and stifle the pandemic, we have to now institute these kind of measures. And they do involve various ways in which people will have much more purchasing power. Another thing is to get rid of student debt as part of the fulfillment of access to education at all levels as a fundamental right. We also need, as a basic right, to suspend and in a permanent way any evictions, foreclosures, and utility turnoffs. And we should arrange things so that there will be mandatory rescheduling of payments, which will be possible insofar as we fulfill the basic right of individuals to be able to have a job at fair wages, and if they can't work, to have equivalent replacement income. All of these measures, if they had been in place, would allow us to cope with our crisis much better than before.
Right.
But now we have to institute them. But admittedly, people will object, we can't put people to work. We have to shut down innumerable enterprises because it's impossible to have proper social distancing and hygiene. And that means all we can do is throw cash at people. Now, admittedly, in some lines of work, it is extremely difficult to carry on in a way that is safe. For example, we have failed to provide broadband to everyone. That means we can't carry on public school education remotely because many of our students will not have access to the remote teaching. So many people in lines of work that could be handled remotely can't do so because they lack the facilities.
Right. So you're saying that we could have had an infrastructure that would absorb this pandemic while maintaining a quality of productivity, and that the pandemic is bad, but the political fallout from having a deficient politics is also doing a lot of work.
Yeah, and we could require every enterprise to start planning and to have already planned for ways of reorganizing their work in a way that is going to be safe, that will have appropriate social distancing at the workplace and appropriate hygiene, and have appropriate stores of protective clothing and masks and everything else that is needed so that they can carry on as best as possible. But admittedly, we don't have those preparations.
And a lot of people say that we don't really need them. Look, if you just give me cash, everything else will take care of itself. We don't need, you're talking about productivity too much. Productivity doesn't matter. I just need cash.
Yeah. Now, admittedly, many people take the view that the government can simply increase the money supply and transfer money into people's accounts using the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. And there's no limit to that. Well, in effect, there is no limit to a government increasing its money supply if it has as much, let's say, monetary autonomy as we do, having a currency that is not convertible. In other words, it doesn't have to be tied to any amount of gold or any other kind of commodity or to any foreign currency. We can increase the money supply and provide it to people. But the question is, will that money, on the one hand, have enough things to buy? Secondly, will the value of that money maintain itself? So if there's a collapse in production and services,
right.
So there's far, far more increasing amounts of money and far fewer goods that it can purchase, which is in a sense a recipe for inflation and perhaps hyperinflation.
Right. So the idea that we give people money, but they don't control what's on the market or how much it costs, would actually not be the solution you're looking for, because we need to think about what we produce as a nation to make sure we produce enough so that our money means something.
Now we could use price controls in the short term, and we can give people buying power, which they do indeed need, at least in the coming weeks, where, because of our lack of responsible preparation, many enterprises find themselves incapable of carrying on at anywhere near full operations in a manner that's safe. During that interim, indeed, we have to allow people to get by. We have to, in a sense, have moratoriums on various kinds of payments, or alternately, give them the buying power to meet those payments. But we, at the same time, are only going to be able to stave off a lack of goods and services that we need, as well as hyperinflation, if we move to, in a sense, resurrect the economic ongoing operations, producing both goods and services as quickly as possible.
Right.
And that means, from a medical point of view, that on the one hand, we have to put vast resources to provide enough test kits, enough protective clothing, enough masks, so that at every workplace, people can go back to work and know that those who have been tested and shown to have been afflicted by the coronavirus, or have known people who have recently been afflicted, can be quarantined. And also those who are particularly vulnerable should be put on paid leave and taken out of the workplace. But that leaves most other people. And if we act quickly and really vastly increase the amount of testing and supplies, we can proceed to bring back work as fast as possible and to move towards fulfilling the basic right to a job at fair wages, which is not a matter of an emergency measure. It's something we need in this emergency to get our country back in operation.
So we need productivity in order to be free. We need other people to be productive in the nation in order to secure our own self-determination, is what you're arguing.
I mean, many people who subscribe to universal basic income want to say, well, look, I mean, work is an imposition. Let's free ourselves of work. Automation is now vastly expanding. There aren't even any jobs to be done. Well, admittedly, automation is taking over many occupations that are mechanical in character and can be automated. But that still leaves vast numbers of, let's say, robot-proof occupations, particularly those that require empathy, creativity, as well as taking care of our automated infrastructure. And we need to direct people into those types of work which are needed and without which we can't survive, and to do so in a way that is as pervasive and as manageable as possible. And this is not impossible, even under these extreme cases. And it's not just a question of not being impossible. It is mandatory because we are not going to be able to maintain our health services. We're not going to allow people to be in houses where they can self-quarantine. We're not going to have food supplies and supplies of all the other goods and services people need unless we can prevent a kind of economic collapse where everyone stays home and receives money that has less and less to buy and continually falls in value.
So responsible politicians are all talking about how do we secure production as well as making sure people have purchasing power. Because if you're not talking about how to secure production, purchasing power. So what does a bailout look like that's fiscally appropriate?
I mean, look, in the next couple of weeks, where we're operating still in a very unprepared state, where many enterprises, not all, but many enterprises, really cannot resume operations in a safe manner because they lack the supplies and organization to do so. We need to provide people with a kind of financial bailout. And I'm talking about both individuals as well as the enterprises that have been employing them and on whose production our lives depend. So we need to do that, and we need to provide that kind of funding on a short-term basis. But at the same time, we have to move as quickly as possible to provide whatever resources are needed to allow businesses, enterprises, both public and private, to organize their operations in a safe way, to have mass testing, to have protective clothing, to be able to have social distancing, to provide broadband access to everyone so that as many people as possible who can work at home are able to do so, as well as allowing as many students to study at home to do so. All of these things need to be pushed ASAP. And then we're going to be in a position where we can, on the one hand, keep the explosion of cases of infections of the coronavirus in check at the same time as we bring back our economy from the brink of a worldwide depression.
And the depression with a D. That's
Yes,
spelled
yes.
differently and sounds differently than
Yeah.
recession with an R.
Yeah.
You're talking about a depression.
Yes.
Difference. I mean, there's a difference in our quality of life. There's a difference in our aspirations. I'm not quite sure that people understand that we already in a depression and now we're just figuring out our way out, or what's going on?
I mean, we don't yet have the statistics to confirm that we are in a depression.
Then
but
we're going to
it's
go through two sectors.
It's
two
quite
quarters
obvious that in many different kinds of industries, transportation industries, hospitality industries, restaurants, schools, all sorts of other kind of retail establishments, they are undergoing, in a way, an almost total shutdown, at least supposedly for just a couple of weeks. But that obviously means that huge numbers of people are being laid off. And if we thought that the Great Depression was severe with 25% of the workforce unemployed, we could be dealing with something that's significantly larger than that. And it could be said to be happening right now. Now, Roosevelt took measures as quickly as he could to put back as many people as possible to work. Now, he wasn't dealing with a pandemic, which complicates that effort. But the pandemic also compels us to make that effort as soon as possible and to do what is necessary to make it as safe as possible. And we have to remember, there are certain people who are particularly vulnerable. They can be taken out of the workplace and provided the means to get by. The rest have to be put to work in ways that are going to be safe. Most people who come down with the coronavirus will not become seriously ill. We have to think of the risks that are involved. We can make things safer. That doesn't mean there will be absolutely no risk, but we can mitigate the risks and retain the economic function we need to be able to handle the health crisis in any fashion whatsoever. So I think we have to recognize we are not in a position where we can simply throw money at people.
No.
Our national wealth, and this is true of most countries in the world, is about 5 times the size of our national income, of the wealth we produce during a year. But that wealth is incredibly unequally distributed As we've heard from Bernie Sanders and others, the top 1% control about 40% of our national wealth. The top 10% control close to 80% of our national wealth. We need to draw upon that wealth now more than ever. And we have to recognize it is the wealth that is available because our national income is on the verge of collapsing. So we have to draw upon that through wealth taxation, ASAP, as a way of buttressing the kind of expansions of the money supply that are going to be required on an immediate basis. But we have that source of wealth at hand to be able to put people back to work, to be able to provide the resources to allow workplaces to be safe. And the sooner we do it, the better. I mean, Singapore is a country that I think is people are becoming more and more aware, managed to jump on this pandemic early on before there was a need for mass social distancing by having as pervasive COVID-19 testing as possible, having as strict tracing of people who had been exposed to people who had been infected, and then ensuring that people engaged in self-quarantine. And they used technology to do it. They used GPS devices on people's phones to ensure that they were staying at home. It had people go on Skype 3 times a day to confirm that they were observing their quarantine measures. You know, these can be regarded as impositions on our liberty to do as we please, but we don't have a liberty to do things that are put others in jeopardy. And for that reason, we can regard these kind of measures as measures of emancipation that are going to allow us to carry on our lives with as little disruption as possible, as soon as possible. And that is what Singapore achieved. They haven't had a single death. They've had total infections in the hundreds. And work and school and everything else is carrying on. Now, hopefully we don't have to undergo the 2 or 3 months that China underwent in a kind of lockdown with overwhelmed medical services and considerable amount of loss of life before we can get back to work. At this point, you know, we are behind Singapore, but hopefully if we think intelligently about what we're doing, we can get back sooner than China did and do so in a way that will not just bring us back to where we are, but put into place measures that will make us more free than we've ever been. And that includes having healthcare provided to everyone free of charge, providing paid leave and paid sick leave and paid family leave, having a federal job guarantee, having equivalent replacement income for those who are unable to work, and having child allowances, having public child and elder care. I mean, after all, we are in a situation where admittedly, if we don't have appropriate testing and social distancing and protective kits, it's hard to set up daycare. But it can be done as safely as possible when parents are not in a position to care for their children, either because they have to work to carry on important functions in our society, or they themselves have to be quarantined. So all of these measures, which should be permanent measures of a free, just society, need to be put in place right away. And it can be done. We have the resources. The question is, do we have the will?
So if you actually believe in creating the quality of infrastructure that will, I think, sustain our nation and be more resilient in the time of pandemic or in the time of any sort of national stress by securing production in the nation through a federal job guarantee and just taking our responsibility seriously to each other, then I think you should support a candidate like Richard Winfield. And he's running for U.S. Senate in Georgia. He'll be on the ballot in November. And you go ahead and go to his website, put in Richard Dean Winfield for Senate in Georgia, and it'll come up. And it's actually like, look at his plans. He actually has issues. So apparently there's a Democratic consultant class that tells candidates that they shouldn't actually tell people what they stand for, and instead just go on a personal narrative. You don't need to know anything about Winfield's personal narrative to know, like, you should vote for him. You just know that, like, a federal job guarantee sounds like a good idea insofar as it secures production. You need to know that child allowances sounds like a good idea insofar as we reproduce workers who, like, we have a public interest in making sure that all parents have enough money to secure a good cultured upbringing for their child. And just go ahead and go to his website, and I think you'll be impressed with what you see, because he's trying to secure us nation, secure us freedom, and through our national institutions in a way that I think we should support. At least I'm going to support. So go to his website. If you like him, give him a little bit of money. And spread this video all around, because governing in the time of coronavirus is actually exposing kind of deficiencies in the way we think about what it means to govern institutions of freedom, and our actual deficiencies in our institutions of freedom. So thank you for your time, and I will see you again. Take care.